Hey everyone, Matt here, making a long overdue, meaningful contribution rather than my pointless stuff of late. Over the course of the last week, I've had some heated arguments, some very heated arguments, with my coworkers. For those of you who didn't watch my video in which I talked about me coming out with my atheism, I'll give you a rundown of what my coworkers are like. They are right-wing, ultra-conservative, not well versed in science, Christian, at least one of them is a young earth creationist, homophobic, and racist. Now, despite all this, they're generally okay guys. Really. But these views do often bring us into intellectual conflict. Because I tend to be left-wing, libertarian, at least moderately versed in science, atheistic, paying member of the HRC, and I don't immediately take a disliking to you based on the color of your skin. I'll get into more issues involving these things in a moment, but I'd first like to address one of the biggest fundamental differences between me and them. I believe in situational support, while they are all or nothing people. Basically, they see everything in black and white. Let me explain with a little example. They believe that when you vote for a candidate for president or senate or whatever, that is tantamount to supporting everything that candidate does throughout his term. However, I believe that voting for a candidate indicates no more than believing that a candidate is the most appropriate, viable option. When I mention this to them, they proposition that if you cannot support a candidate 100%, you shouldn't vote. And if you do, you are supporting everything they do and therefore must defend it. Now, that's just one example of their black and white view of the world. It's all or nothing. Either you take everything or you leave everything. And I don't agree with that. But that doesn't matter. To them, as with a lot of people like them, the world is divided up into us and them. Us is everyone that agrees with what they agree with, and them is, well, everybody else. I wanted to bring this point up for several reasons. The first is to illustrate how they separate themselves from all other people. And the second is, well, much more important. As with many people of their bent, they have the habit of rejecting everything that comes from an opposing view out of hand, even if this is true or relevant. If a liberal told them something, they'd immediately reject it unless a conservative came along and said the same thing. This is annoying, but what is really dangerous is the fact that unless presented with irrefutable conflicting evidence, or sometimes in spite of irrefutable conflicting evidence, they will immediately accept anything that comes from a right-wing source. To give you a brief example, they believe that Bill O'Reilly should run for president because he has all the answers. Think about that for a few seconds. If it doesn't give you a chill, you probably haven't grasped the concept yet. Now, I'm eventually going to bring the subject around to ethics. However, I wanted to give you this bit of preamble in order to set up what is to be the bulk of my point. We were working, and oft as the discussion goes, they ended up talking about how Obama is fucking up the nation, and how he is tearing apart the Constitution, and giving all our hard-earned cash to the crack-smoking Obamans. A brief explanation. Obaman is the word one of my coworkers came up with after Obama came into office. Essentially, every time you hear me say the word, you can just insert the word nigger, because that's what they mean. Hey, remember when I said they were essentially okay guys? Let me put a qualifier on that. They are essentially okay guys as long as they aren't talking about anyone of a different ethnicity, because this shit gets old really, really fast. But I challenge any of you to come up with an argument that will change the mind of two late middle-aged, deep south, good old boy redneck types. They're not exactly flexible in their opinions. Anyway, they asked me how I felt about this, seeing as I'm a Democrat, which I'm not. This again is an example of the old us or them thing. If you're not a Republican, you must be a Democrat. So, having had a few fruitless discussions about the whole crack-smoking Obama thing, I just left it alone and mentioned that I don't think Obama is thinking about the Constitution yet. The only thing I can think of off the top of my head that I disagree with him constitutionally, that I'm aware of, I mean, there could be other things I just haven't encountered yet, is his record on the Second Amendment. However, I brought up that there wasn't much of the Constitution left to fuck around with after the last 8 years. So they then challenged me to show how this was the case. I mentioned the warrantless wiretapping thing, and that is a whole other discussion I'll put up here sometime. They have some, in my opinion, really obnoxious views on the subject. And the denial of due process. Now, I didn't get a chance to go on because they immediately jumped on the due process thing and assumed, partially correctly, that I was talking about the Guantanamo detainees. Incidentally, while I was talking about them, I was also talking about domestic terror suspects who are U.S. citizens with no connection to foreign nations being held on U.S. soil. But I digress. So they jumped on that and said that the detainees were being held as enemy combatants, so they aren't entitled to constitutional protection. Hey, the Supreme Court might disagree with you there. I'll sum up the rest of the conversation in brief. It ended up with us being on opposite sides of one major issue. They believe that it is acceptable to do anything to terror suspects because terrorists have done and will do horrible things. I posed this exact question to them. So, you think that because terrorists are monsters, we have the right to be monstrous towards them and do everything just as bad to them? To which they answered, unequivocally, yeah, that's exactly it. Now let me remind you about their all or nothing stance and how it comes into play here. They believe that everyone the government suspects of being connected with terrorism is a terrorist that has actively plotted and participated in attacks against U.S. citizens. They make no division between the two. If you are suspected, you are guilty in their eyes. Anyway, back to the discussion. Then they posed a question to me. So you think that a terrorist who has killed U.S. citizens should have the same legal rights as, say, your dad if you were brought in on DUI charges? To which I responded, absolutely. You then told me that everything I've said is meaningless simply because I believe that all people have the right to due process. If a person is as obviously guilty as my coworkers think them to be, there wouldn't be a judge or jury in the nation that would have a problem convicting them. I don't see what the problem in giving people the right to due process is. And there was some more discussion, which led to one of my coworkers stating, "One of these days you'll have to choose a side. You can't fence sit forever." Now, I had a few choice words that I shared with him. However, I'm going to save these for my next video, in which I'll outline the details of my personal ethics. However, I'd just like to state one thing. Believing in gray areas doesn't make you a fence sitter. Not every situation is as simple as people would like it to be. Deal with it. Seriously, it boggles my mind just how little people want to think. It's so much easier just to lump everything together in one big group, call it one thing, whether it is or not, just for simplicity's sake. I mean, we do this all the time in small ways, but when it comes to ethical issues, it causes a lot of problems. And people get all up in arms because they really don't want to think about it. They don't want to consider it. You can't have a rational discussion about certain ethical things because people will get all emotional. And people have a huge problem separating intellect, emotion, and ethics. And that's another thing I'm going to get into in a subsequent video. So I'll leave it here for now. Please tune in and see part 2, in which I detail my personal ethics.